Hello. I want to talk about myth a little bit. Now, I am obsessed with mythology, and of course, I was going to find a way to sneak it into this world literature class, but there was no really reason to sneak it in because myth is the basis for much literature in the modern world and definitely in the ancient world. And so I wanted to have a module on myth, and in particular, I am dwelling on the creation myths because number one, there's a couple of them in the text, so you get to use the text, but also because those creation myths that go back for centuries and centuries and centuries still have an effect on us in the modern world. But I also want to talk about the objectives for the class and how discussing or how they apply to myth is what I should say. So if you see my eyes go over this way, it's because I'm looking at the objectives that I had up on the screen. And first of all, the first objective is identify the basic characteristic associated with the genre study. Now, of course, there are many different genres within the realm of literature. And myth is one genre and is one of the earliest genres. And characteristics of myth are, number one, they are associated with a religion. Myths are not separate from the religions, the sacred tales of religions, even though Barry Powell criticizes Joseph Campbell for doing that association. I don't see how we can separate them because the myths of the Greeks underpinned their religion, as do the stories of the Hebrew and Christian scriptures. Not to offend anybody from calling those tales myths, but if you compare them with the tales in other religions, they are basically the same tales, and they change only in details, but the gist remains the same. Without those tales, where would the Hebrew and Christian scriptures be? So that is one of the characteristics of the myth is that they are associated with a religion. Now, Campbell says there are four purposes of myth, and I'm not going to go into those. And myths in all cultures support and show those characteristics. If anybody's interested in those, let me know, and I'll give them to you. And they are fantastical. Now, the next module is going to be on fairy tales, and fairy tales are a different genre from myth. And they are different because myths have fantastical happenings and fantastical beings, but they are associated with religion, whereas fairy tales are not associated with religions. Both fairy tales and myths do not have authors. And so when we read the fairy tales of Hans Christian Andersen, by definition, those aren't true fairy tales because we know the author. And Hans Christian Andersen also infuses his myths with Christian ideology. But those are some of the characteristics of the genre, and they apply across the board to myths, old myths, newer myths, and so on. Now, the second objective of this class is to explain the importance of symbols and language in literary works. And when we read a poem, when we read poetry later, and when we read some other works later, we are going to talk about the symbolism, especially in the poetry, because poetry is largely a language of symbols. Now, there are some types of poems, for example, ballads, that aren't as heavy on the symbolism as other works are. But myth is a language of symbols. And when we read a myth, not only is it historical allegory in that it can record actual historical occurrences, but it does so in metaphor and myth. And so the war between the Titans and the Olympians, it is historical allegory for the battles that Aryan invaders had with the Pelasgians, who lived in the area that is now known as Greece, and in other areas, Turkey as well. They made that history into a myth. And so it is a language of symbol, a language of allegory, a language of metaphor. And the language in and of itself, aside from being symbolic, myths are presented in different forms. However, next week when we talk about fairy tales, you know that fairy tales begin once upon a time. So in the fairy tales, the language does become more important. Now, the third objective is to explain the historical and cultural context of the selections read. And this is of huge importance when we read the myth, because not only, as I just explained, the myths are historical allegory, but they embody the religion of those cultures. And anytime we try to separate religion from many cultures throughout the world and throughout time, we can't do that, especially in Egypt, especially in Greece, and especially in other countries like Egypt, where the governments were theocracies. They were based on the religions. In Egypt, the Pharaoh was not only king, he was a god on earth. And we see this in Japan as well. Now, we're not going to read Japanese myth, but this exists. So the history and the culture that is represented by the myths and is embedded in the myths is very important. And there's going to be an assignment on that. So be thinking about that. We're also going to evaluate literature based on aesthetic, philosophical, and social criteria. Now, these fit in very closely with the third objective. And when we say aesthetic, is it art for art's sake, or does it have a deeper meaning? And this is a question that is consistently brought up. And can we read a work just for pure enjoyment, the aesthetics of it? When we think of visual art, the aesthetics is the beauty and how it appeals to us visually. But within a written work, the aesthetic value is a combination of the entertainment, but does it have a moral of the story? Myths often have a moral of the story. Fairy tales always have a moral of the story. But when we read other works going through time, you will need to ask yourself, does it have a moral of the story? Personally, I think it is nigh on impossible to have a piece that does not have some moral of the story, even if the piece is trying to say the moral of the story is there is no moral of the story. Still goes back to teaching us a lesson. And a word that with which you might be familiar is didactic. Some works are overtly didactic. Fairy tales are. Some philosophical essays and other type of essays are overtly didactic, but maybe some aren't overtly intending to teach us a lesson, but still do. The philosophical aspects, what does it embody of the culture? How do the myths or other works that we are going to read embody the philosophy of the time and or the culture? The same with the social criteria. I mentioned Campbell's 4 functions of myth, and one of them is social. Myths teach us how to live within a society. They give us lessons. The myth of Narcissus says, don't be so in love with yourself that you shut out other people. Many myths teach against being overly proud, aka hubristic. Hubris is the downfall of many people in Greek myth, but we also see this in the Hebrew scriptures when Nimrod tries to build the Tower of Babel to reach heaven. The tower and Nimrod are both knocked down because they are hubristic and take on aspects that only a god or the gods in polytheistic religions should take on. So they are highly social lessons. And when we look at other works in the future, we will look at those aspects as well. What do they tell us about the society that spawned those works? And what do they tell us about those societies and their rules and their regulations, their philosophy, everything that is embodied within a culture. So keep these aspects in mind as you are reading not only this genre of mythology, and not only for next week when we read fairy tales, but also for future works that we are going to read.